Good evening. Good evening, everybody, and welcome. Welcome to the Brandt Lecture. I'm Mark Bannister, Dean of the College of Business and Economics here at Boise State University, and we're very pleased to have you in attendance tonight for a very special evening. Please take a moment and pull out your cell phone and silence it or turn it off. I turned mine off to make sure that I'm not the guy in the front row whose phone goes off. So please do that. I'd like to express our deep gratitude to the John and Ora Brandt Foundation. Were it not for them, this lecture would not happen. Their financial support and the leadership that they have provided allow us to put on this presentation, and we know they do much more. John and Ora Brandt's extraordinary lives and commitment to their community, described in tonight's program, continue to make a significant contribution to the people of Idaho. I'd like to express appreciation to members of the Brandt board. Don Brandt was unable to be here tonight. He's president of the Brandt Agency and chairman of the foundation. In attendance tonight is Bob Rathbone, a businessman here that we greatly appreciate his support and interactions with the College of Business and Economics. Judge J.R. Schiller is up here at the front. Don Anderson, former CFO of Lyle Pearson Motor Company. And John Barnes, local real estate developer and philanthropist. And I would like to introduce the chairperson of the economics department here at Boise State University and also the Brandt Fellow of Free Enterprise Capitalism, Ann Walker.
Thank you, Dean Bannister, and thank you everyone for being here tonight for the 15th Annual Brandt Foundation Lecture. One more friendly reminder to silence your cell phones if you didn't do it the first time. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, he asked that I give you his email address for anyone who wants to be on his mailing list. We should have put it up on the screen, but we didn't think about it beforehand. But for anybody who's interested in joining Dr. Hanke's email list, you can let him know at Hanke, Hanke, at jhu.edu. That was Hanke at jhu.edu. He sends out some very interesting material, so feel free to join that list. At the end of tonight's talk, there will be a question and answer period. When that begins, if you'd like to ask a question, you can proceed to the aisles and the microphone stands where undergraduate and graduate students from the Department of Economics at Boise State will assist you. We do ask that you try to make your questions as brief as possible so that other people have time to ask questions, and that they also be genuine questions with a question mark, and that they be respectful, of course. Also, to minimize disruption, we ask that you stay seated until after the Q&A session is completed. And at that time, students will be available to collect extra credit slips from the students who are in attendance here. There are feedback forms in your program, and we would welcome your feedback. So if you would like to fill out a feedback form, you can hand it to student helpers outside the event on your way out. And we will also include you on the Boise State email list to notify you of College of Business and Economics speakers in the future. Biographical information for tonight's speaker is available in your program, as well as at the Boise State website for the Brandt Foundation, which is brandtfoundation.boisestate.edu. The purpose of the Brandt Foundation Lecture Series is to bring to Idaho those who are making important contributions to the public understanding of the foundations of a free and prosperous society. One of those foundations is a stable and dependable monetary system. We live in a world today where governments and central banks have complete authority over our monetary systems. And there is no shortage, history has no shortage of examples of governments that have chosen to sacrifice the value and stability of their nation's currency for the sake of short-term benefit. For many of us here tonight, we are experiencing the highest level of inflation in our lifetime, or at least for me within my memory. And as inflation has resurfaced as an economic problem facing the United States, a myriad of explanations have been offered, ranging from corporate greed to supply chain snarls. But the primary cause of inflation is explained by one of the oldest theories in economics, and it has nothing to do with corporate greed. Tonight's speaker isn't just a scholar of monetary theory and policy. He is an active practitioner and the person that many governments around the world have called upon to help reform their broken currency systems. He has served as an advisor to heads of state in countries throughout South America, Asia, Europe, and helped to reform currency regimes in many countries, including Estonia, Bulgaria, Argentina, Ecuador, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and that included 2 official cabinet-level appointments in Lithuania and Montenegro. He has co-authored more than 20 books and monographs and hundreds of articles on currency boards and dollarization. He served as senior economist on President Reagan's Council of Economic Advisors from 1981 to 1982. He writes regularly for Forbes magazine and the Wall Street Journal. He is senior fellow and director of the Troubled Currencies Project at the Cato Institute in Washington, D.C. He is a senior fellow at the Independent Institute in Oakland, California. He is currently a professor of applied economics and founder and co-director of the Institute for Applied Economics, Global Health, and the Study of Business Enterprise at Johns Hopkins University. And he was recently named the 3rd most influential economist in the world by Focus Economics. And last but not least, he has the distinction of being one of the only economists who accurately predicted the resurgence of inflation in the US. The Brandt Foundation Lecture Series is honored to present tonight's speaker, Dr. Steve Hanke, and his topic, Looking for Inflation in All the Wrong Places.
Thank you. Oh, thank you very much for that introduction. It's a pleasure to be back in Idaho. It's been 40 years. The last time I gave a talk in Idaho was over in Caldwell, and I've kept in touch with Idaho because Senator Steve Sims and I are very good friends, and we're colleagues. I was not a senator. I was what they call a staffer. But Phil Rehberger, who is here in the audience, was a staffer for Sims too. And at that time, I was chief advisor to the Joint Economic Committee, and Sims was an active member, and we became very good friends. And Rehberger was chief of staff, and you know, people always would say, "Well, what's Rehberger doing anyway? And what's his job?" And his job was to keep Sims and I on the straight and narrow and out of trouble, mainly. So I always knew something was up when Sims and I would come back into the office and Rehberger would be cringing. At any rate, enough of that. I've kept in pretty good contact with Idaho via Sims. I do get reports. We stay in good contact. Of course, he lives in Leesburg, Virginia, but is an Idaho man through and through. Tonight, we're going to talk about finding inflation in all the wrong places. That's the title. And needless to say, it's a topical topic. You don't get this kind of timing most times when you're giving a speech about finance and economics. But let me start with just a little background. on inflation and the measurements of inflation. What are we actually measuring? Well, it is 8.2% right now. That's a consumer price index, a headline number. And that's an aggregate index that includes about 300 items. And when they look at those 300 items, they get a sample of about 70,000 different prices for those 300 items. And that goes into the index, the consumer price index, this aggregate thing that we're familiar with. There are also other kinds of aggregate indexes. You sometimes see them talking about core inflation, and that's simply the consumer price index with volatile food and energy prices cut out and eliminated from the index. There's the producer price index, that's another aggregate, and so on and so on. There are hundreds of indices that are these big aggregates that have a lot of things included in them. We also have different kinds of inflation. The kind we're suffering might be a 40-year record, but it's nothing compared to hyperinflation, which I actually know quite a bit about. There have been 62 hyperinflations in world history, and a hyperinflation is when the inflation rate is running at 50% per month or more. So it's zooming away. For the record, and as a reminder, Hungary has a record. 1946, the inflation rate hit 207% a day. 207% a day in Hungary. Zimbabwe, 2008, that's a hyperinflation actually that I measured, the only one that actually ever was able to measure it, 98% a day. So you can see it's a long way down there from Hungary, but it was still big. And number two. Number three, I measured that too, and that was in Yugoslavia, 1994, 64% per day. And now we can get out into kind of a monthly number. The monthly number was 313 million%. That's equivalent to 64% a day. So I was there, I measured it, I have some sense of what goes on in these hyperinflations. You try to get rid of your local money like a hot potato. I mean, you literally, the minute you get a local bill, you run down to the black market and get either, in those days, a Deutschmark or a US dollar in Yugoslavia. So we're down to Germany, because all of you have heard about the hyperinflation in Germany, 1923. But that was number 13. It's way down on the list, actually. And that one was only 29,500% per month. But compare that to Yugoslavia, 313 million% a month. So that's what inflation, kind of, we're getting around these big aggregate numbers, the things you normally see. There's another item that's very important, and that's relative prices versus these aggregate indexes. Because within the index, there are prices of, for example, a consumer price index. You've got 300 things in the basket moving all around. Some move up, some move down. Now virtually all of them in the United States are actually rising. But at the start of the pandemic, in early 2020, what was going on when the inflation just was starting, coming out of the gate, we had commodity prices going up, goods prices going up, and asset prices starting to go up, houses, equities, the stock market, that kind of thing. But actually, the service prices, remember we were locked down, so you couldn't go any place, service prices, what are they? Your haircut, that's a service. So what happened? You stayed home, you had your wife or girlfriend cut your hair, or maybe you cut it yourself, or maybe you even, went native. Who knows? But that was a start. Now, where are we? Now, the commodity prices are going down in the basket. Asset prices, look at the stock market, they're going down in the basket. Service prices are surging. We're reaching new highs now in service prices. And wages are going up. So you get these relative price changes that are going on inside the basket. And this is an important concept to keep in mind, because these relative price changes, they are real, but they're due to changes in supply and demand. The aggregate, what lifts it and pushes it up and down, changes in the money supply. So separating these two things is extremely important, kind of conceptually. So what have we been told about inflation? First of all, remember it was transitory. Well, we all know that's a lot of bull. That didn't last very long. That was a great Washington, D.C. line. So that was not true. The second thing, the causes, which Ann alluded to, first it was COVID. Then it was supply chains. They're still writing about supply chains. Then it was the Putin price hikes. Then it was oil prices, and then fertilizer prices, and you name it. It's just a new excuse every single day. But those are all things that, while factually true, oil prices did go up. That's a relative price change. Oil was going up relative to other things that were either going down or staying more or less stable. So there's the aggregate thing and the relative price change movement going on. We also were told that inflation is global. That's the latest pitch out of Washington. It's global. No, inflations are always local. They are not global. If you see them throughout the world, it simply means that the central banks are all copying each other, and they do that a lot. They copy the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve usually takes the lead, and the Bank of England followed, and the European Central Bank followed, and the inflation rates in England and the United States and on the continent are more or less the same. But think about Japan. What's the inflation rate? 3%. Switzerland, inflation rate's 3%. China, huge country, 2.8% is the inflation rate. So inflations are not global, they are local. And those three countries, remember, Switzerland 3%, Japan 3%, China 2.8%. When you're talking to your neighbor and they're going on about supply chains or some other BS cause for inflation that they've read, by the way, wall to wall in all the media in the United States, because the media is a captive of Washington. They repeat what they're told in Washington because the reporters need access to get into the Fed, into the White House, into the Congress. And how do you get access? You don't get access by dumping on the narrative that's being put out on the Hill, in the White House, or over at the Fed. And this gets to my 95% rule. Every class I start, I always tell the students, and this, I'm talking about really peer-reviewed journals in economics and finance. My 95% rule is 95% of what the students are going to be reading is either wrong or irrelevant. Now, if the media is up over that 95% range, we're getting over towards 100. Wrong or irrelevant, whatever you're reading in the newspaper. So we're getting to now to where the rubber meets the road. What does cause inflation? Inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. It's caused by changes in the money supply. I've looked historically at inflation throughout the world, and I have never found what I call a sustained significant inflation of over 4% a year. That's half of where we are now. Of over 4% that's lasted more than 2 years, that hasn't been preceded by a huge increase in the money supply. Never. So that's kind of exhibit number one, as the lawyers would say. I've just completed a study looking at 157 countries from 1990 to 2021. And what I did, I took the annual rate of growth in the money supply and the annual rate of growth in inflation, and the correlation between those two things, the correlation coefficient is 0.9. That means it's about a 1-to-1 lock. Increase the money supply by 10%, you're going to get a 10% increase in inflation. Reduce it by 10, and you get a reduction of about 10. So we get into what economists look at, and what I look at in particular, is the quantity theory of money and something called the equation of exchange. And the equation of exchange, this is mainly for the students. I know they're getting extra credit, so we gotta do your thing. And it's clear they've been incentivized. I like that. You know, they have a free market thinking chairman of the department. She incentivizes things. I mean, you know, you show up, you punch your ticket, and get extra credit. That's the way to do it. So what is the equation of exchange? It's MV, that's money times velocity of money, and velocity of money is just the quantity of money divided by real GDP. So money times velocity equals P times Y, and P is the price level. That's this aggregate basket kind of thing, one of these indices, times Y, and Y is the real rate of growth in the economy. And that study that I did, 157 countries, with looking only at money and inflation and coming out with a correlation coefficient of 1, that means and implies that the velocity and the real rate of growth, Y, in that equation of exchange are pretty much constant. They're not fluctuating around very much. So that's why the whole thing collapses to just M and P, because V in the MV is pretty constant and Y is pretty constant, and you end up with something that's valid and something that can be useful. And John Greenwood and I did use it. John is not only a close friend, a colleague at Johns Hopkins, he actually lives in London. He was the chief economist at Invesco for many years until he retired last December. And he's a quantity theory man, a monetarist like I am. He was the one who, by the way, designed the Hong Kong currency board that was installed in 1983. He was the architect of that. So we're in the same camp, shall we say, and working together all the time. So in July of 2021, we used the equation of exchange, and when we wrote it out, if you look at our article, it has MV equals PY. Even the Wall Street Journal, they had allowed us to put an identity in the thing, and we did. And we had a forecast, and we were the first and only people to actually put numbers on where we were going with inflation. We said that inflation would end up at 6%, would go as high as 6%, and maybe as high as 9%. Well, in June, it peaked out at 9.1. We weren't quite on target. We're at 8.2 now. So we hit the bullseye with using the quantity theory of money and the equation of exchange. Now, let me go with a metaphor that I think will allow everybody to understand what's going on with this quantity theory. Forgetting the MV equals PY, that's for the Boise State students to get under their belts. But go to the Hanke's bathtub. Hanke's monetary bathtub works like this. The money goes into the bathtub through the faucet. And the bathtub has two drains and one overflow valve. And one drain is that money that comes in, that money supply growth comes into the tub, and one drain is used to accommodate, the money is used to accommodate real economic activity. So that drains some out. You need money to run the machine. So that drains out one drain. The next drain As the economy is growing, the demand for money increases. People want more money in their retirement accounts and their money market accounts and their savings accounts and so forth. So that drains some out too. That's some of that new money coming in drains out. And you're left maybe with a residual, and that residual goes out the overflow into inflation. So money comes in, it revs up the real economy, real economic activity without any inflation, and the demand for money. And here's what we have, roughly. Since February of 2020, this is kind of back of the envelope, but it's always good in economics to, if you can't get it on the back of an envelope, you got a problem. And most modern economists can't get anything on the back of an envelope. So there are a lot of problems out there. About what's gone in through the faucet, about a cumulative 40% increase. So we've had about a 40% increase, and about 2% each year goes out the real economic activity drain. So over the last 3 years, that's takes 40 minus 6, because we've had 3 years. And the demand for money, it turns out, that's also about 2%, roughly. That grows at about 2% as the economy is growing. So that's another 3 years minus 6. You end up with what? 28% is left in the tub. And that is a pretty good estimate. Between 25 and 30%, the aggregate price index, the consumer price index that we started with, that I was talking about, that will increase pre-COVID versus post-COVID by about 25 to 30%. The index will have to go up because the excess money in the tub, it's got to go out. It's not going through those two drains for real economic activity and the demand for money. It's not satisfying them. So it's going out in inflation. Inflation shows up in the index. And that means that the index has to be up by about 25 or 30% after, let's say in 2023 going into 2024, than it was in 2020 when COVID started and when they started pumping up the money supply. So using this equation of exchange, where do Greenwood and I think that inflation is going to be going in the last, I've got to move along. I wanted to finish this thing in 25 minutes so we can have plenty of questions and time. I'll wind it up, don't worry. So where do we think it's going? The end of this year, that's this December, the year-over-year inflation will be between 6 and 8%. And next year, that's end of 2023, the end of the year in December, the year-over-year inflation will be about 5%. And since we hit the bullseye with that first forecast, you can be assured we're going to hit it with the one that I just gave you. Now, just quickly, I will turn on and put one. Here's the process, and this is how the money supply actually works. So you got the fact that there's a connection. Inflation comes from the money supply changes. Okay, we're there. Now the question is, well, what's a transmission mechanism? When the money supply is goosed over here on stage 1, you have growth in the money supply. Within about 1 to 9 months, there's a lag and asset prices go up. Now, what happened? We started goosing the money supply in February of 2020, and if you weren't heavy in the stock market and buying real estate and sensitive commodity prices, you were a loser. If you understood this, you were winning big time. I mean, it was just a chip shot. Then 6 to 8, there's another lag, and we have the real economic activity starts revving up. And that, remember, we had a little spurt where economic activity really started shooting up, real economic activity. And then the big lag is inflation, 12 to 24 months. Now, the reason I'm giving you this is that if you think about this and you're investing and really trying to figure out what's going on, this is the transmission mechanism. It doesn't just automatically go from changes in the money supply today to changes in the inflation rate today or tomorrow. There's a big lag, and these lags are very tricky, and that is the trick for an analyst. If you're a monetarist using the quantity theory of money and don't understand the lags, you got a big problem. We think we understand them pretty well, and that's why we got the inflation forecast right in July of 2021, and that's why I think we're going to be right this time. So where are we now, actually? A picture of, you've got the bathtub in mind, but here's actually what happened. You see that, first of all, we have that blue line. Now that's a growth rate in the money supply measured by what they call M2. That's the broadest measure of money that the Fed has. So that's a Fed kind of number. So the money supply, you can see the thing zooms up and peaks out in February of 2021, and then it's come down, and now it's this is year over year. It's a little, what do we have, 2%, 2.1? I can't, my angle isn't so good. I know it's around 2. 2.6, okay, Alan, thanks. 2.6. So that you can see we've had a huge increase in ballooning in the money supply. Now, anyone talking about supply chains, Putin prices, all this other nonsense, I mean, look at this thing. You don't think you're going to get inflation when you do this? Now, that orange line is an important line, and that's called, what I call and define as the U.S. golden growth rate. And that's 5.5%. Now, how you get that, you use the equation of exchange, MV equals PY, and you solve, you do a first derivative of that, and then you get M plus V equals P plus Y after you do the derivative. And this is not going to be a quiz question. I relax. A few people kind of tensed up on me there for a minute. But if you do that, and you rearrange the identity and solve for M. M is the golden growth rate. That's the growth rate in the money supply that you want to be aiming at if you want to hit the inflation target of 2%. And the 2% is the P that you put in the equation. In other words, 2% is the inflation target, so that's P. Y, for the U.S. economy, the potential growth in the U.S. economy is 2.2%. So just plug 2 in. And the velocity is a negative 0.2, and you're taking velocity around to the other side and subtracting, and a negative is a plus. So 2 plus 2 plus 2 is 6. So that's with the numbers I gave you, that's the golden growth rate. In fact, if you fine-tune it, it's about 5.5. We were growing the money supply on average since COVID at about 15%. So we were growing at about 3 times faster than the golden growth rate. So we had to be way over the target with inflation. So that is that point, and if you'll recall, fortunately there are people in the audience that are, I think, damn near my age. If I can quote Paul Harvey, and now you've heard the rest of the story, folks. So let us go to why the Fed, and this is the last point. I know I'm maxed out on my time, my self-imposed deadline. By the way, the organizers were free, very libertarian kind of people. Do whatever you want to, Hanke. Don't worry about it. But I put a constraint on myself, and I've gone a little bit over my constraint, but not too badly. So So why have we been told to look for inflation in all the wrong places? Well, Congress and the White House started this. And remember, Trump was the president then. So this is a bipartisan thing. Everything in Washington is much more bipartisan than you think. I mean, they're all bad. That's one reason I knew I could come here and be safe. But that's actually the best line I've had tonight. But so it all started with Congress and the White House with COVID doing what? Spending a lot of money. And the deficit increased. So that was step one. Now step two is the critical thing for inflation. And it was critical because the Fed came in and they monetized. They bought about 90% of the Treasury bonds that were being issued to finance the deficit were monetized by the Fed. Now when they do that, they just create money out of thin air. They just credit the government account at the Fed, and that's it. The money supply grows. And that's why that blue line shot up. Now, why, again, have we been told to look for inflation in all the wrong places? The other, I didn't do it. The guy behind the tree did it. You know that old song. They don't want the noose around their neck. The Fed does not want to be blamed and fingered for causing the inflation that we have. So you have some other cause. It just came from another plan. Christine Lagarde, the chairman of the European Central Bank, said, it just came from nowhere, she said. Such a stupid comment, but she doesn't even have supply chains or anything. It just came from nowhere. We don't know where it came from. So that is the reason for this, this big lie. Now, if you look at the Fed specifically, it's really one of the biggest mistakes they've ever made. The Great Depression was the biggest one by far, but this is pretty big. And you've had Chairman Powell, Chairman of the Federal Reserve, testifying under oath that the money supply doesn't have any connection to economic activity or inflation, and that the Fed doesn't really watch the money supply. So as a result, we've got Powell canceling the quantity theory of money, Washington in general canceling it, blaming somebody else, and we have them constructing kind of a bridge to nowhere in Washington, D.C. They're really flying blind. And one reason for this, besides getting the noose away from them and off to the sidelines, there actually is another reason that I think is significant, and that is because the staff at the Fed they have over 400 economists. None of them got the inflation forecast right. We all know that. They all said it was going to be temporary, so that was the end of that. The Democrats outnumber, and Phil will appreciate this, the Democrats outnumber the Republicans 48.5 to 1. Now, why is that significant? That's significant because the punchline here is the dean of the quantity theory of money is Milton Friedman, the biggest expert, the biggest practitioner, and so forth. And as you know, he had tendencies Republican in nature, and anything Friedman, and he was effective and a deadly debater and a clear person in argument, and you naturally have the Democratic staff. Anything that Friedman was for, they're going to be against. So I think the politics of the thing, besides this getting out from under the problem they created, is a big thing. Because remember, they're trying to get out from under the problem they created, but before, when they deep sixed the quantity theory of money and ignored it and let this thing go out of style, that was more the Friedman kind of thing. We're not going to bother and look at the money supply. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, I think I should wind it up and open the floor for questions and answers. Thank you very much for your attention. Looking forward to your questions. I should add one footnote before the questions, because in going so fast, I skipped one big thing, and I told you where I think inflation's going to be the end of this year in 2023. The question is, where's the economy going to be? It's going to be in the tank in 2023, because if you look at that right-hand we're at 2.6, the year-over-year growth, below the golden growth rate. If you look at it in a more granular way, the last 7 months of data, not the year-over-year, but the last 7 months, the money supply has actually been contracting in the United States. And the only 3 times we've had sustained contractions were 1929, 1937, of course, you had the Great Depression. You had a huge recession in 37, and 1968. We've only had 3 times. So we're in really uncharted territory. We're going to have a big recession. The engine won't run when the money supply is in reverse. So we're going to have what they call stagflation. We're going to have inflation, but we're going to have also a recession. So welcome to the 1970s. I mean, there are enough gray hairs that you remember all that. You know, Jimmy Carter, and we went through that drill. So we have a question.
Yes, thanks for your presentation. Is it safe to assume that your money supply theory is responsible for the rising cost of college tuition or college education, or is it just simply professors get paid too much?
Well, that actually is a good question. That deals more with the fiscal side of thing, because the government subsidies in education have been one of the biggest drivers for increased cost, and in particular administrative cost. You just have now layers and layers of, deans. I know they run a lean and mean machine here, so we don't have that problem. I mean, somebody from Kansas being a dean in Idaho, I mean, that's pretty safe hands. There's not going to be much fat in that budget, but at any rate, that's a big. The fuel comes from Washington. And then think about it. It's you're subsidizing the tuition, and you're gold plating the universities, and it's not the professors, by the way. They've slimmed down. Now they hire adjunct professors, teaching associates. When I first went to Johns Hopkins, no one but a professor was ever allowed in a classroom. Forget the teaching assistant thing, or adjuncts. There were no adjuncts whatsoever. Now they hire these people because they're cheap, kind of day labor type thing, and the administrators. Of course, for an adjunct, you need a dean to handle that, and then if it's a graduate students, well, you need another dean to handle that and administer that. So you're getting kind of the picture of.
Sure.
By the way, I might add one thing that might be of interest to you, is that most people don't know this, so we're breaking news. Any reporters in here? Johns Hopkins, for the 42nd year in a row, is the #1 research university in America vis-a-vis the budget. And the budget, the research budget at Hopkins is $3.1 billion a year. So it's a huge operation. It's double number two. Number two is actually the University of Michigan, and then it goes down from there. So need a lot of administrators. You got the federal money pouring in.
As long as the bulk of that research money isn't studying the mating habits of tsetse flies or something.
Well, there's a little bit of that going on, but this last rocket they used to shoot down the meteorite or whatever it was, I can't remember now. That came from Hopkins. So this stuff's expensive. That's why the research budget's so huge.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
I was wondering where the 2% inflation target comes from, and is there any particularly economic logic for that?
It's completely arbitrary. It's a political number. So that's one thing I like about getting out in places like this. You have people with some common sense, ask intelligent questions, can do back of the envelope, all of this stuff. But it's an arbitrary number. They just pulled it out of there is no economic theory. And now, by the way, the latest thing, they're debating changing the number because we've got global inflation. It came from someplace from out of space. Maybe we've got to change the target. So that's an actual debate now. But 2% is just arbitrary. It is an even number, so yes.
So I actually have two questions. The first, what is your forecast for the U.S. dollar and euro exchange rate? And the second, once inflation is already increased and a recession is probable, what advice do you give to investors?
Okay, the first one, the dollar, since the U.S. is, there are two things going on with the dollar. So one is that the kind of advertised thing, and that is the Fed is increasing the interest rates a little more rapidly than other central banks. So the rate of return on investing in dollars is more attractive relative. Again, it's a relative price thing relative to other places. So that's one thing giving the dollar a lot of strength because it's very strong now. The second thing is something that's not advertised because it's verboten in the United States, and that is the war that I think the U.S. was quite responsible for in Ukraine. I'm of the U.S. provoked camp. The Russians drew an absolute red line in 2014, and this is, again, a Republican, W, just went over the line. I mean, they basically, the red line was Ukraine cannot be a member of NATO. That was 2014 in Bucharest. And the U.S. signed an invitation inviting them into NATO. And then there were many other things going on. So we have the war going on, and that's always good for the dollar because there's a gradient that goes from the field of battle, moving away from the field of battle. Currencies get stronger and stronger. Closer in, they're weak, but you get further away, and the dollar is the international currency, and we're a long way from Ukraine. So those two things are making it very strong right now. I think with the recession and the stagflation coming, that we will eventually, and I'm not predicting when, see a very sharp fall in the dollar. But for now, it's golden. I mean, it's really strong, and will remain so for a while. Now, this gets back to this. You see, to figure this out, you've got to get these lags in there. And when will the money contraction we have actually hit the real economy and maybe even mainly the real economy. We don't know for certain, and that will determine to some extent when the dollar starts coming off. But I think the dollar for now, very strong, and eventually will take a big dive. I think it's basically very overvalued. Now, the second question, I got so carried away with the first one that
So, like,
I got off on the Ukraine thing, which I
right now, do
probably
you recommend investing in like physical hard assets, or what's your investment counsel? And when there's a lot of rising inflation,
lithium. So it's you know, now that we're into, you know, even today, Alan takes me in his EV, you know, Tesla. Needs a battery, needs lithium. So there's a big demand, and a lot of people have been raising money and raising lots of money because they have the next magic lithium production facility going in, but all of that's basically smoke and mirrors. So I think lithium prices will stay very strong for quite some time. So if you can find a vehicle for that, and the rest, I would stay cash heavy. Stocks will go down, by the way. This sequence, by the way, your question brings up an interesting point, because interest rates have started going up in the United States because interest rates always follow the inflation rate. They don't come before inflation. Inflation comes and then interest rates go up next. Interest rates are going up, and that takes the price-earnings ratios down. And so we've seen stocks come off badly because of adjustments in the PE ratio, just because interest rates have gone up. But earnings we have not talked about. And if you look at the earnings forecasts, they're ridiculous. I mean, the consensus is like earnings growth is like 6.5% for next year. It's never going to happen. And the reason why is the recession. But that hasn't been factored in because all the 26-year-old analysts on Wall Street have never really, quite got it together yet. They're having a learning experience, and that will bring earnings. They won't make consensus. Earnings will come in next year below the consensus, and that will take the overall index down. So don't be in an index. That's because it's going down further. That's my. Cash. Cash is golden, but lithium or good companies. You got to pick and choose. There are good companies out there. Everyone's not going down. I said the index. It's kind of like the price index. Remember, the price index goes up and down because the money supply moves up and down. But inside the basket of the index, relative prices are moving all over the place. Same with the stock market. I mean, some things are going up, some things are going down. More are going to be going down than up, so the index is going to be coming down because earnings will come in definitely below the consensus. So thanks for the question. Yeah.
Thank you, sir, for your ideas. In my thinking about pandemic, hindsight is 20/20, and my understanding is that MV equals PY. Velocity, from what I know from the early pandemic, went down. Y went down. That necessitated perhaps M going up. In your mind, thinking about this going back to March of 2020, again, hindsight's 20/20, but what would you have prescribed if not the Fed doing something that they did, given the statistics that occurred?
Just a couple of things. One thing on velocity, Greenwood and I have a big study. It isn't published yet, but it's a very highly technical thing, and most economists just don't understand velocity. But we've looked at 89 countries, and it turns out that in developed countries, the velocity number is minus on average. This is the median now, the kind of midpoint. It's for the OECD developed countries, the median is minus 1.7, and it's very stable, and it's minus 3.1 for the developing countries that are growing very fast. Now, and it's very stable, and what you find out is that if you move away from those stable numbers, they revert back to the trend, whatever the trend was, and they revert back pretty fast. So that's why in that 157 country study that I mentioned, you find that M and the money supply change and the inflation change are almost perfectly correlated, because V in fact is pretty constant. And by the way, we always know Y is pretty constant. You have business cycles, but the potential in the economy doesn't change very fast. So it's pretty constant. Now, you asked something else that was actually more important. Oh, what would I do?
So in the pandemic.
Yeah. What would I do? Okay. So here's what happened. The pandemic, they decided they were going to lock us down. So the government tells us we can't go to work, we have to put chains around the factory gates, all this stuff. So my view is a libertarian kind of free market type. The government's liable to us for the damage they imposed on us by locking us down, and therefore the government should fork over damages. So the idea of the government paying and expanding expenditures, the way they did it, the modalities, you can argue about that. But in principle, if they lock you down, they're liable and they should pay. So the question is, how should they pay? And they should have paid by doing the following. The deficit would have increased because government expenditures would have increased, but they should have sold those bonds, the treasury bonds, to the non-bank public, to you and me. And if they would have, the deficit wouldn't have been monetized, the money supply wouldn't have grown, and we wouldn't have inflation. And the reason why, if the government sells you a bond, what happens? You give them cash and they give you a bond, so they're actually sucking liquidity out of the system, and no money is created in that transaction. You give them dollars, they give you a bond, and that's the end of it. And the money supply doesn't change. So the idea, here's the main point. The idea that you probably all got in your head is that if you have a government deficit, you have inflation. No. Government deficits do not necessarily cause inflation. It depends on how they're financed. If the central bank finances them, you've got inflation. And that's what you have, like in all the Latin American countries, endemic, because the central bank extends credit to the fiscal authorities who are irresponsible and spending too much and creating deficits, and they can't go into the international market with bonds. They got the local banks up to here with local bonds, so they go to the governor of the central bank with a deal that he can't refuse. We got some great bonds for you. And he creates what they call pen money. He signs and the credit goes to the government. So that's the way inflation works. So it is very connected to the fiscal side of things, but you have to kind of think it through, and sometimes knee-jerk reactions aren't the right ones. Government deficits don't necessarily cause inflation. They often do, because the central banks come in and monetize the deficits. Yeah.
So it's nice to see that you have a pictorial of the Cantillon effect. If you were the Fed chairman for a couple of years, how would you undo this damage in a least painful way?
Okay, that's a good question too. I told Ann the questions are always better than the talk. So how would I do it? You go back to the golden growth rate. They should be growing the money supply at about around 5%, something like that, and let the inflation come out of the tub, the excess overflow, and by early 2024 we'll be down 3%, maybe coming down pretty close to if they would do that. But the problem is, remember, they're not looking at the money supply. They're flying blind. They're flying in an airplane with an altimeter that doesn't have anything on it. Now, you know very well, out in Idaho, that can get you killed in a hurry. And it can in Washington, too, because they are not looking at the money supply, by the way. They have not made any noise about what's happened with the contraction in the money supply over the last 7 months. And I think, by the way, our one only hope, they did the same thing. They had quantitative tightening in 2019, and it caused a huge liquidity problem on Wall Street, and they pivoted immediately and loosened up. They changed. So in a way, I think our only hope is what might happen is not only a recession, but I didn't mention, we could have a big liquidity crisis on Wall Street because of this contraction in the money supply. And if that happens, they do watch Wall Street, and they do watch liquidity, and they will pivot and loosen up. But the right way to go is get an altimeter, keep it at about now 5%, 4.5%, something like that, and just let this excess naturally drain out of the system. And if you did that, you see, you'd avoid the recession, and you'd avoid maybe a huge liquidity problem that I think is a big risk, actually.
This may not be in your area, but you are involved in it. You alluded to how in education, as they expand, there's more deans, there's more departments, there's more activity, there's more cost associated with that. That happens exactly in medicine too. As the hospital systems grow, they get more assistants, vice presidents. And my question is this. Well, actually, I'd like to get in the bathtub with you in just a minute.
Okay. Yeah, well, it's a great place to be. There's a lot of excess money in there. I mean, you know.
So one of the drains was economic activity.
Yes.
So that's perceived as positive. But is it necessarily positive? For instance, if the money goes to expand the personnel of the educational system beyond the need, is that a positive activity? And as a consequence, if then the tuition rate goes up, then the government comes in and says, we're going to give you student loans. But they don't give you the student loan just for the tuition. They give it for your housing and your books and all those things. And so that consequently results, as it has exactly here in Boise, in an abundant supply of new apartments targeted to the students at prices which the average person can't afford. So we have a consequence of the growth which we want that has an inflationary effect on it. And so part of that drain has to come back to your overall.
Okay, well, the drain thing, let's stay in the bathtub, because that's a good point. You can explain this with the drain. The 2% drain is good, because that is real economic activity. Now, and we don't want a depression or a recession. We want that drain positive at the potential. The potential is about 2% now, about 2.2 actually. But back to your point, due to the misallocation of capital and mainly the intervention of Washington with regulations and so forth, the potential has gone down. It used to be about 4%. So the drain has gotten smaller, you see. It was a better drain when it was 4%, when we had less regulation, less subsidies, less misallocation of capital, more efficient tax system, whatever that interfered with the market, and that interference with the market has actually shrunk the drain from potential of like 4% down to about 2%. So you can use a bathtub to explain your point. And your point is, and the intuition is correct, but the drain idea is what you want to think of. Over time, the drain's been constricted Washington constricts the drain, basically.
So how do you get the infrastructure back in balance so you don't have so many deans, so many vice presidents? Well, skip the university, but in the hospital system.
No, the hospital. I know the hospital very well because you come from our hospital, and I told you my daughter is a professor at Johns Hopkins at the medical school. So I know it very well because I get firsthand reports from her, and it's worse than you think. Now, and how you fix it is really I was going to say the $64,000 question. Remember that? I mean, that's peanuts now, but the $64 billion question. Thank you.
I think we have time for 2 more questions. Folks already in line.
Whoop! I'm supposed to be alternating, so go ahead.
During the Trump administration, we were the largest oil and gas producer in the world. It was, in my opinion. I don't know what you thought of that time. But since the administration ended, it seemed like if we were able to produce more oil and gas based on what's happened in the world, what's happened in Europe, that would have been a good thing to been producing even more oil and gas. And I wonder, does that relate any way to what's going on with inflation at this time?
Yeah, it does relate to the relative price thing. The relative price increase of energy went zooming up, and that wouldn't have zoomed as much if we hadn't put in an administration who's, anti-energy in short, or I should say anti-oil, anti-gas. And I actually did a tweet today that's precisely on this point. I have a whole series of tweets that they're called Hanke's Believe It or Not. And the Hanke's Believe It or Not, the one today, was President Biden said a couple of days ago, "No more drilling." Now, as far as I can remember, you've got to drill before you can find oil and produce it. So I think that kind of gets at your point.
I'm going to ask you.
Yeah, remember that expression, drill, baby, drill? I don't know.
I'm going to ask you to do something that might go against your fabric as kind of a free market libertarian guy, but you mentioned that a large part of that kind of spike in the money supply was caused more by a political problem. Is there a chance for maybe a political solution, and what is it? Is it just more kind of partisan balance in the Fed, or where do we go to make sure that this doesn't happen again? Okay, so no, I'm a classical liberal, which is a much broader. Libertarians can get off the reservation. So Phil knows all about that. So the problem is a technical problem. You say it was political. Obviously, it was at a certain sense, but it's a technical problem because you had the Fed and the Fed staff who deep-sixed and canceled the quantity theory of money, MV equals PY, and were flying blind. I mean, they didn't know they're incompetent. I mean, they are incompetent. I must say, and I have former students who are actually on the research staff down there, but they are incompetent because anyone ignoring the quantity theory of money is just or flying without an altimeter, as I put it, is just out of it. So they made a technical problem error, a huge technical error, by the way. I think this will be the second worst performance of the Fed since the Great Depression, and they wouldn't have had to do that. They could have spent money like drunken sailors, like they did, which in principle I think they should have for the reasons that I gave, but they could have financed all of that by selling bonds to the general public, and they wouldn't have increased the money supply. Okay, it would have increased, interest rates would have increased because people aren't going to be buying bonds if they're getting paid zero interest. But so I think it's more of a technical problem. It does have politics in it. I mentioned one thing, the ratio of Democrats to Republicans on the Fed staff of economists of over I think there are 416 as I recall. I can't remember the exact number, but at any rate, this is a problem because they do dismiss anything associated with freedmen, and anytime they can do a job on freedmen, they do it. So, but that leads them into a technical incompetence because what goes on in the economy just doesn't comport with their as they call it, dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models, that don't even include money in the models. I mean, this has been going on for 30 years, by the way, in macroeconomics. I mean, if you're a student, Paul Romer has a great article about how economists destroyed macroeconomics in the last 30 years, and it's with these dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models. They're bad for your health. Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, given what you just said, and I think earlier you said you consider yourself a monetarist?
Yes.
Is that correct? Do you believe that Fed policy should follow a regimen where there's sort of an expected increase in the rate of the money supply over time? In other words, not reacting and increasing it a lot and decreasing it a lot?
Yeah, that's the golden growth rate.
That is the golden growth rate, and
Yeah.
do you have an idea what that increase in the money rate should be over time? Is there a concept?
Yeah, well, right now it's 5.5.
Year to year?
That's this. That's the orange line.
And that's the increase in the money supply. The Fed should just stick to that. I guess I'm also suggesting that then maybe there should be controls in the Fed that doesn't allow them to increase the money supply more.
Well, want a Great Depression?
No.
I mean, you got the monetary bathtub. You have the two drains that have to be fed. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, the whole thing collapses. So if you don't put anything in the tub, and the amount needed to accommodate real economic activity is 2% a drain per year, and 2% for increases in the money supply, and you're putting in 3%. You got a deficiency. You got a problem. You're going to have a big recession.
Okay, so the Fed should have flexibility in increasing the money supply to some amount.
Well, they should have flexibility in the sense that this is not like an exact science. And when I say I'm a monetarist, I'm a quantity theory of money, but I don't like to get. I'm applied, so I like to use, paper, pencil,
Gotcha.
change things around. You gotta go with the flow, but you've got to have principles, and the quantity theory of money is a principle, and it works. So, people. The fellow asked before about velocity a little bit earlier, and they'll come up with all kinds of historical studies, evidence, peer-reviewed articles. Well, velocity was fluctuating too much. We couldn't do this, that, or the other thing. And my only kind of rhetorical comeback for that is, well, maybe it didn't work in that study. It worked for Greenwood and Hanke. There was no one who put a number on where we were going with inflation except Greenwood and Hanke. That's the only place you'll find a number. And that's early. I mean, after the fact, a lot of things happen, but and we were pretty close.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. One last question? Going, gone. Thank you very much. Oh.
just last week.
Oh, okay. So they, yeah.